They were bombing us to hell. They slaughtered them in the bloody water.
I didn't believe it. It was the British Army. I didn't believe it.
I felt suicidal for being through such a horrible situation.
Despair. Just waiting.
Wait for me. Wait for me. I never thought I'd see it, but I did.
The screams. You never forget the screams.
The news of the defeat of Poland was a devastating blow to an already troubled Europe. The German army, proud and strong, paraded in front of their revered leader, Adolf Hitler. Hitler was overwhelmed with his army, who had delivered him a spectacular victory. The victory came with few casualties and very little loss of equipment and supplies. Unbeknown to the army, Hitler was already planning his next conquest, France. When, in September, his troops moved west, it was to embark on a very new and different type of war. The invasion of Poland automatically drew Britain and France into the war. It was a huge gamble for Hitler. It meant leaving his western front virtually unprotected, and a small French offensive could possibly create greater problems. Hitler had cleverly calculated it was worth the gamble. The Poles were brave, but the front was too large to protect. In 4 weeks, it was all over. For the loss of 800 dead, the German army had vanquished an army 100 times that number. Medals were struck, and there was much backslapping. But in some German quarters, there was still deep apprehension. To the relief of his generals, Operation Yellow was continually postponed. Winter was coming. Tanks and aircraft performed better in good weather. The Western Allies looked on and made no attempt to seize the initiative on mainland Europe. The British Expeditionary Forces moved across to France, but for them it seemed a never-ending waiting game.
To us, it didn't seem like a war, except towards the end of the time, around about February, March time, a couple of Germans, obviously observation planes, were coming up very high up and obviously photographing. It was very frustrating. We were pretty well brassed off, to put it honestly.
Meanwhile, the final plan of attack was put forward by General Erich von Manstein. A fast victory was paramount. The German economy was still weak and couldn't sustain a long conflict. Manstein's daring concept concentrated on the French Ardennes region. He proposed initially a conventional assault on the Low Countries, then the gamble of a devastating armoured push through the Ardennes followed by a rapid drive to the sea. With their communications and supply lines cut, the Allied forces to the north would quickly collapse. It was a high-risk gamble that relied on the weakness of the enemy. Here, unfortunately, Hitler had good reason for confidence. The victors of 1918 had seen little need to change the working structure of their land forces. Although France had the largest and arguably the most modern army in Europe, it still hadn't moved on in strategic thinking. Gallantry and smartness on parade was valued above initiative or imagination. Only the occasional bright officer, such as the young Charles de Gaulle, showed initiative to anticipate German tactics. Even after the fall of Poland, an official army report said any similar lightning war would be impossible in France. France was also a deeply divided society. A series of weak governments had eroded public confidence. The working class were unenthusiastic about a capitalist war. Sections of the prosperous classes even had the audacity to blame Britain for bringing them into the war. The horror of the first great conflict of the 20th century gave both the military and the civilian population a definite defensive rather than an aggressive outlook. By May of 1940, the Germans were poised. The French Premier Paul Reynaud was courageous and decisive, which could not be said for many of his colleagues. On the eve of the invasion, his government fell and became merely a caretaker. Confident the French would not move past the Maginot Line, the Germans left their main frontier with France only lightly guarded. The main German army was grouped at Reuenstadt in the south. Although the French made belated attempts to create armoured divisions, the generals considered tanks as mobile pillboxes and not the effective war machine they were capable of being. The French generals thought a mass armoured attack would be disposed of easily by anti-tank guns. This may have been the case if the French had deployed them where they were needed. The Germans made no such mistakes. The most potent weapon in their armoury was the high-velocity 88mm gun originally designed as an anti-aircraft gun. The Germans discovered it was just as formidable against tanks. The large French air force surprisingly was under the control of the army, which had a ridiculous and antiquated command structure. At their headquarters, there was no radio and only one telephone. Orders could take up to 2 days to reach the front. At the core of Allied strategy was the famous Maginot Line along the German frontier, ending at the tip of Luxembourg. Thereafter, the defence relied on the difficult terrain of the Ardennes. Between the Ardennes and the coastal town of Dunkirk stood a very thin line of defence. The French generals expected an attack through Belgium, in which case they would move troops north to consolidate along the line of the Daal. The British Expeditionary Forces under Lord Gort would be part of this movement.
On May the 10th, the Germans invaded the Low Countries, and we was, at 4 o'clock in the morning, we was rudely awakened with bombing. We was then assembled very quickly to our sections, and we set off for Belgium. I arrived with my section, or part of my section, at a place called Halt, just south of Brussels.
When the Germans started their invasion, we went up into Belgium. We were told we got to form a line of defence where we were, to let the RAF, the RAOC, all the corps troops are coming to come out, get them out. I didn't know where we were going anywhere.
We were given a supply and ammunition to one of the infantry battalions who'd come in for it when all hell broke loose across the valley. There was gunfire and bombing and everything going on, and it was from then onwards we were more or less in retreat. We didn't know where we were going. We went back to our company headquarters near Popperinge, and from there we moved off what was the retreat into the Dunkirk perimeter.
This time I didn't have any arms at all. I didn't have any weapons whatsoever. Well, they had to send back to Arras to get weapons for about 3 or 4 of us. And when we finally got them, we got a pistol and 6 rounds of ammunition.
10 divisions strong, the BEF was woefully underprepared. Its light infantry tanks had a single mounted machine gun. Only the Mark II Matildas, armed with surplus naval 2-pounders, could make an impression on the enemy armour.
We went into France with 1914, 1918 equipment. Let's face facts. And 1914, 1918 tactics, which we was given a horrible lesson. I mean, when you see a 2-pound shell bouncing off a tank, it's a bit disheartening.
I don't think we had the weapons that the German armour division had. Later in the war, we were transferred to an armour division, the 7th Armour Division, and it was then we were getting the good tanks, Shermans and Grants, and the English tanks. I mean, our tanks in France have got a little 2-pounder thing on it, which was fired a shell about 2 inches across. I mean, it wouldn't touch the Germans.
Like France, Britain had sleepwalked into war, but public opinion was beginning to accept that Hitler must be stopped. People had lost faith in Chamberlain. On the 10th of May 1940, Churchill became Prime Minister. Coincidentally, it was the same day Germany moved into the Low Countries. "30 German divisions had struck simultaneously. Specialist units had rapidly secured vital Dutch bridges and airfields. Aware of Hitler's intentions, Holland and Belgium had stayed neutral to the last. Now, coordination with the Allied armies was paramount. By 6:30 that morning, Germany was attacking from the North Sea all the way to the Moselle. The French placed their 2 best armies at Namur and their weakest, the 9th, in the south. On the second day, the Belgians were already in retreat, moving towards the River Daal. The French and British moved quickly north to aid their new allies.
I was left at the mayor's house in Talmas, which is a few miles from Flessel, where the main units were. And at that time I was looking after an officer and driving him when he was required, and acting as an amateur interpreter, because I'd learned schoolboy French and I was a link between them and the main unit. And this gendarme came up on the morning of the 12th of May, and he came to me and he said, "Is it true the Germans were at Saint-Quentin?" Well, Saint-Quentin was about 25 miles from us, behind. We couldn't believe that they could have come through and got round behind us virtually without knowing anything about it until the last minute. We'd had no warnings at all up till then.
Of course, things moved on. The Belgians was coming back, our men was going forward. We ended up at a place called St Arnaud. We came on detachment of the 145 Infantry Brigade, and we come under the command of the Brigade Major, who then said to us, "Two to a motorbike, make your way for Dunkirk. You're no good to us with a pistol and 6 rounds of ammunition. We're staying. You'll live to fight another day. You should get through. The road's under shell fire, but do the best you can."
Meanwhile, the mass of the German forces was swiftly moving through the Ardennes. They were sighted by an amazed French reconnaissance pilot. His pictures and report were ignored. Within days, the German army and panzer divisions were crossing the River Meuse. The Germans were now firmly established in France and moving very fast. It was now that the great trap was sprung. North of the town of Sedan was the weak French 9th Army, poorly trained and badly equipped. Most of the troops were middle-aged conscripts. They had no artillery, and the French Air Force had been decimated on the ground. They had no idea of the ferocity of the German onslaught and collapsed immediately. Between Dinant and Sedan, a 50-mile hole had been made in the French defence. There was now nothing to stop the Germans going all the way to the northern French coast. A panzer division could move up to 40 miles a day. The Luftwaffe were awesome at knocking out airfields, fuel dumps, and rail junctions. This was a different war, a war the Allies were not prepared for. At 6:30 on the 14th of May, a message was broadcast by the BBC. Private boat owners were asked to register all craft with the Royal Navy's small boats pool. The Germans were now at the Dahl. Retreat was inevitable. On the 15th of May, Holland capitulated. That day, Sedan also fell. The French thought the Germans were advanced towards the capital. They were wrong. They were moving towards the sea. The route of the German advance lay through the great battlefields of the First World War. The slow-moving, retreating Allied troops were like lambs for the slaughter to the Luftwaffe, and the roads were clogged and congested with refugees. By the 17th, as the nightmare grew worse, the War Cabinet were facing the reality. Evacuation was imminent. By the 20th of May, all links to Paris were severed. The Allied forces were now falling back on their last bastion, Dunkirk. However, their objectives were varied. The Belgians and French saw the port as a supply point whereby a counteroffensive could be mounted. Failing that, they would surrender. For the British, it would be the evacuation point, and they would regroup to fight another day. Churchill did not find the thought of chaotic evacuation an easy pill to swallow. He even instructed General Gort, who was near the town of Arras, to mount a counterattack southwards. Gort had only 4 improvised battalions available. The BEF had only 16 Matilda tanks remaining. The French could offer nothing, and there was little hope of air cover. The shattered Allied forces were still 50 miles from Dunkirk, but on the 23rd of May, Army Group Commander Kurt von Reinstadt ordered all German forces to stop at the River Aar. The directive was confirmed by Hitler himself the following day. For 3 days, the beleaguered, hemmed-in Allies enjoyed a valued respite. We can only guess why the Germans stopped. After the fall of Calais, the halt order was rescinded. The tensions were now concentrated on the French forces still behind the Somme. The Allies were now hemmed in an area between Ostend and Gravelines. There was panic and confusion. It was every man for himself. The order was just, get to Dunkirk.
We took all our vehicles with us first of all, and then at one stage it would be, I think, the 28th, 29th of May. We dumped most of them. They put holes in the tanks, drained the water out of the engines, and then ran them till the engines seized up. We were being bombed most of the time, and I remember watching a German twin-engine plane actually being shot down. And I think it was in a little valley, and everybody who'd got a weapon of any kind in that valley opened fire on it. It was a great, it was really joy to see one coming down.
I think I counted 73 bombers. And if you've ever been bombed like that, you're in absolutely a shock condition. And you just try and avoid being in it again, you see.
We were just told to go down that road which would lead towards Dunkirk, but due to the fact that we constantly having to hop off the road into ditches to avoid being hit, we got split up. And I finished up with 2 or 3 others. We were marching on and walking on our own, and we did hitch a lift on the back of a French lorry that had got a mobile cooker on the back of it. But unfortunately, it turned off the road and took us about a couple of miles away from where we wanted to go, so we had the job of getting back onto the main road.
A little way over there was a road, and there was a French horse-drawn convoy which was carrying artillery shells. They bombed it, and have you ever seen a cart horse hanging from a tree by one leg after being bombed?
We realised then that things were a bit dicey because obviously we were surrounded. So we waited until dusk and then gradually moved back, this time now, obviously towards the coast. We still hadn't been told that there was going to be anything like Dunkirk. It was just really chaos as far as we were concerned. It was just a question of moving, stopping, parking up, sending dispatch riders out to see what was going on, happening. And this went on for about 6-7 days. We could see Dunkirk in the distance, and we knew that by this time we'd lost nearly most or greater part of our vehicles. We were just small little groups. We were never an organised group at the time we got to Dunkirk.
At Lille, the French attempted one final counter-attack. Although fruitless, it allowed the British a comparatively smooth retreat. On the 26th of May, the War Cabinet secretly authorised the evacuation from Dunkirk. It was called Operation Dynamo. Of the 300,000 trapped, it was expected only 45,000 would be saved. Dunkirk was ablaze.
By the time we got there, it was absolute chaos. There was dead horses laying here, there and everywhere, dead blokes. They were bombing us to hell, and bomb, machine gun, blokes trying to get out in the sea. And I just shunted off back up in the dunes and stopped there.
And Dunkirk was absolutely been bombed and shelled to pieces. It was all rubble. There was a huge pall of smoke from where the oil tanks were burning.
Young, exhausted soldiers arrived to witness the complete horror of the situation. For many, it was a living hell.
The blokes were laying everywhere. Well, I mean, it was just like a bloody turkey shoot, wasn't it? You got, my Christ, old Jerry just up there with his Stukas and straight down like that, machine gun straight. What could the poor buggers do? They slaughtered them in the bloody water, on the beaches. The screams. You never forget the screams.
You see, I didn't see the little ships as such when they came, so therefore we were there trapped on that beach. It was despair. No. Nothing goes through your mind. You don't. What do you do? What do you think about?
Unbelievable to see what we saw, as it were, the massive troops and everything. It's difficult to describe it. I didn't believe it. It was the British Army. I didn't believe it.
No organisation, not where I was, no organisation at all. The organisation started to come when the smaller boats came in and ferried the lads out to the bigger boats. But what officers were there were trying to get their own chaps into groups, to get them off into groups. But we'd lost our group. I mean, we'd lost all ours. We were more or less on our own. The horror part of it was the fear that you thought you might be the next one. That was the problem.
A young soldier brought a boat in. They sent just one sailor with it, you know, and everybody rushed and tried to get aboard. Some were turned over, and it wasn't really organised at all.
The operation was masterminded by Admiral Bertram Ramsay deep underground beneath Dover Castle.
Vice Admiral Bertram Ramsay was brought out of retirement to aid the war effort in 1939 and moved into the secret wartime tunnels in 1940 to direct and plan Operation Dynamo. Dover Castle was used as it had a series of underground tunnels that were secret at that time, and so it was an ideal location for a naval headquarters. The tunnels were used by the Navy since the First World War, but they were brought back into operation again by Ramsay for the planning of the evacuation of Dunkirk.
Dover Castle was a perfect location to control the operation. 40 destroyers and another 129 varied boats were in readiness. Young naval rating Dick Sharp had no idea what lay ahead.
Well, we wasn't exactly told about it, but we knew there was something big going on because, well, with the news on the radio, this 2.5 ringer, he come down and he detailed, we were lined up in 3 ranks, two ranks of seamen and 1 of stokers, and he came down and he chopped off 3 at a time, if you know what I mean. You 3 in that boat, you 3 in that boat, and it come to Loopy's turn, myself, and he said, right, 2 seamen, 1 stoker in that boat. And I said, excuse me, sir, permission to speak. I'm being, I was only a sprung, a second class stoker. He said, yes, lad. He barked at me. So I said, where are we going, sir? Where are you going? He said, don't you know? So I said, no, sir. He said, you're going to Dunkirk. So, cool, everybody looked at everybody. So I said, well, could we have life belts? We got no life belts. God, I thought he was going to take off vertical. No effing life belts. And give credit where it was due. He stopped operation there and then and sent for life belts from Chatham Barracks. We all got a life belt because a young lad in my boat, young lad. I was only 20 myself, but he said, Christ old Dick, he said, thank God for that. He said, I can't swim.
There were few places boats could get in. The harbour had been bombed. It was the outer harbour called the Mole that was the only place left. Many troops managed to get away from here.
Sergeant Major officer, someone was, come on you lads, he said, come on, he said, you're going to be taken off the Mole. And anyway, we all marched down to this Mole. There was a damn great hole in it where a bomb had hit it, and 2 bloody planks. Just 2 planks, that's it. We got to the end of the mole and says, all right, back, we're full up. This boat, the boat she was in alongside the mole when she was full up, she backed out like that, turned round like that to take off and took a bloody bomb straight on down the funnel. And that done that.
It didn't really register to me so much about the others going on so much until we realised that the officers and everybody had gone. We were just left with the sergeant. And the sergeant then managed to get us on 1 in every 50 that went on the Mole. And I can remember going on the Mole. There was a big hole in it. We had a 6-inch plank to walk over. But I was the first on it, and I was right down into the bowels.
So out we goes again, and I'm walking along the promenade and this bloody Stuka come over. and I see this lovely big silver egg come out. And that bomb landed on the beach at the bottom of the promenade like that. It hit down there like that. And I stood there, says God's honest truth, I stood there and I watched the blast go straight out to sea like that. Somebody was watching over me then, wasn't they? Anyway, they loaded us all up again and we marched up to the mole again, and this time we got on this destroyer.
There was very little air support. Flying from Kent the RAF would be of little use, and Air Vice Marshal Dowding knew the game was up and there was no point in sacrificing precious aircraft for a lost cause. However, the troops on the ground weren't to know that. It was still total chaos on the beaches. For some, it was to be a long wait.
I reckon I was there about 6 days. We were being bombed, we were being mortared, they were lobbing shells over us, Stukas was having us. It was pretty horrific.
Everybody was very philosophical, I think. Probably everybody was so worn out and tired, it doesn't register to that extent. You know, you just, as a trained soldier, you do what you've got to do, and that's it.
When we got onto the beach, we each dug, we had a little spade that we dig with, and we dug a hole in the sand, and I went there, I got in the hole when night came, covered myself with the blanket, and went to sleep. I woke up freezing cold because somebody had stolen the blanket.
For some, though, the chaos of the beaches was too much. Many decided to get away under their own devices.
I was on there 4 days. We saw a boat out that was upside down. They'd been turned upside down by panicking, using odd bits of material we found about. We plugged up the holes in it, but we hadn't any oars and it needed 8 oars. Anyway, 3 of us went up and down the shoreline and we found 4. We thought we might be able to get out with 4. When we got back, the boat was full up with people waiting for somebody to do something, you see. Well, I wasn't very polite. I told them what I thought of them, and 1 or 2 of them got out, enough for us to get in. But we had to get some more out to push the boat off the breakers.
For a while we could see what was happening as the naval ships came up there. They were pulling up where the mole wasn't damaged, and the chaps were jumping or trying to jump the bit that was broken, and the navy chaps, as they came, was grabbing them and pulling them up onto the mole. Those that missed it went down.
Driving vehicles out to make a pier, driving them into the sea and driving others on top, making a pier for the lads to go. Vehicles was just pushed driven into the sea, you know, and then others driven on top to make a pier. As the tide changed, they shoved the vehicles out.
On the 31st of May, over 68,000 troops were removed from the beaches and the mole. For many, the relief of getting on the boat proved too much. The emotion and exhaustion meant they can't even remember the crossing.
Went down below, found a bunk, climbed into it. The next thing we knew, it was Dover in the next morning.
We were really absolutely tired right out. I don't remember much about the crossing, but I remember pulling into Folkestone Harbour.
We got out all right. We was attacked. I don't know how far we was out when we was attacked, but we was attacked by aircraft and bombed. But it didn't hit the ship, and I could hear the bomb splinters rattling on the side of the boat. And from that time on, I couldn't tell you another thing. I don't remember another thing until I got into a station, in the train in the station in Kent, somewhere in the south of England.
We got on board this destroyer, and all of a sudden all hell broke loose. guns going off everywhere. And I suppose it was the captain on this destroyer. He said, "Cease fire! Cease fire! You're firing on one of you." And the poor little bloody little Spitfire, all on his Jack Jones, come over there.
It was effectively a news blackout about the evacuation. Still, the small boats were heroically taking troops off the beaches and ferrying them to larger ships some half a mile offshore.
The lieutenant who was in charge of us, he came in on one boat and he hopped over the side because the water, well, it was knee deep, shall we say, just over knee deep. It was very shallow. And he went ashore shouting out, "BEF ahoy, BEF ahoy." And there wasn't a murmur, you know, and I could feel the hair on the back of my neck creeping up because it was my first taste of war and I'd never experienced anything like it. The guns were banging away at Dunkirk and what have you. Well, I know we were all green and we'd never seen anything like it. But we rowed and rowed, just kept going. You knew there was men waiting. You just rowed to the nearest big boat and dumped the troops and went back for some more. Wait for me. No, it was a terrible thing. Men in panic. I never thought I'd see it, but I did.
By the 1st of June, the beaches were littered with the waste and debris of war. Those still there were exhausted. The Luftwaffe became once again active, and 4 destroyers were sunk. Ramsay ordered there should be no more daylight sailings. On the following day, the signal finally went out. BEF, evacuated.
We were called in at the last. When we arrived up to Dunkirk, the Germans were already there, and we went into a wood. We got separated from our squadron, and we then got surrounded by Germans. And I took the last message on the tank to ask what we should do, and we were told to destroy the tank and make our way to Calais. And then unfortunately, we got the message that Calais had been taken. I know we tried all the ports along, and each time the Germans were in front of us. We got into Brest, and we eventually got down to the docks, and this small boat came in, which I know now was a collier, with a load of coal that he brought from Scotland to Southampton. And then he'd been told to go over to Brest and pick up any stragglers. And it was a Scotch kipper, and he said, as I come in, jump. And about 30 to 40 of us jumped onto the tarpaulin on the coal.
So what are the lasting memories of those who were there?
Hearing a naval officer shout to somebody to put a cigarette out on the mole as we were coming off, getting along there. It sticks in my mind really, because he gave all sorts of threats with it if he didn't put it out, what he was going to do to this fellow who'd lit up.
I think it's something that you never get over. Things that happen to you, like when we was being dive bombed, we had a pig running loose. We shot it and cooked it for dinner, but we had to run across the yard one at a time to get it because of the aircraft. And where I was in a cellar type thing. I felt something underneath me, and it was a little dog. And it was like this, terrified.
I can remember I pulled and I caught a crab. They all went up in the air and my feet went, they went up in the air. This chappie in the boat next door, I couldn't see who he was. He said, "Pull, Jack, pull." So I won't tell him what I told him to do. And he said, No, Jack. He said, "You're doing a bloody marvellous job." He said, "Keep going, please."
One of our officers was sitting up in the back of a Bren gun carrier, well exposed, with 2 revolvers. If the Germans were going from house to house, he was shooting them, That got the bastard.
When we were in a slip trench, and the Stukas came over, and obviously when they came, you dive wherever shelter there was. We were on the edge of just on the edge of the beach in the town when I'm talking, and the Stukas came over, and you could see them as they came. You saw the bombs coming out of the plane, and I knew by that time which were going to be for us. And I remember saying to the chap beside of me, "I think we're going to get one of these, lad. Get your head down." I remember saying that. And the next thing was there was a terrific explosion very close nearby, and smoke and dust and stone and dust flying about. And I turned to talk to him, and he'd been caught in the neck with a bit of shrapnel, and he was dead. That's something I don't ever get out of my mind, because a yard, and that could have been me.
The thing that strikes me, of course, is the planes coming down, as it were. But don't ask me if they were Messerschmitts, I don't know that. But they're just coming down and either, dropping the bombs. That was nothing. It was the machine gun. It was terrifying. You see, everyone. I'm telling you the way I saw it, and every Dunkirk vet has got his own story to tell.